Today, I'm very lucky to be talking with writer, astrophysicist, musician, and theatre actor Alan Smale about Radiant Sky, the second book in his Apollo Rising series, following the critically acclaimed Hot Moon. Alan Smale writes alternate history and hard science fiction and is a two-time winner of the Sidewise Award for Alternate History. He is also a rocket scientist, having recently retired as director of HISARC, a division of NASA. Alan seamlessly blends his extensive scientific knowledge with his uncanny ability to present complex ideas in understandable terms to create riveting stories that invariably garner outstanding reviews from readers. His works include over 40 short stories published in some of the most iconic science fiction magazines, such as Asimov's and Abyss and Apex. His original Clash of Eagles trilogy won widespread acclaim from both critics and fans. Alan grew up in Yorkshire, England, received his doctorate in astrophysics from Oxford University and currently resides in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area with over 100 published academic papers. Thankfully, helping me navigate the worlds of astrophysics and science fiction is Lachlan Marnoch, a late-stage PhD student in astrophysics here at Macquarie, who looks at the host galaxies of radio transients. Lachlan is also a temporarily lapsed writer of science fiction and fantasy with ambitions to return to his writing once his thesis is submitted. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on from the Lighthouse. I'm looking forward to it.
So, Alan, just to get things started, can you tell us when, how, and why you made that leap from astrophysics to science fiction writing, or was science fiction writing always a passion?
I would say that writing was always a passion. There was never really a leap because I was always kind of doing both at the same time, both in parallel for a long time. I've been writing for as long as I can remember. I've probably been writing roughly as long as I've been reading. And certainly when I was 6 or 7 years old, my mother still has things that I wrote then. Of course, those are things like Tarzan rip-offs and not very inventive stuff, really. Star Trek fanfic is what some of that would be called now, because I did write some Star Trek stuff as well. And I wrote some James Bond stuff, Bond-ish stuff in my early teens. So I'd always been writing and I'd always wanted to be a published writer. And I was also interested in astronomy for a young age. I was very into the Apollo program when I was young, which is going to be obvious when we talk about Radiant Sky and Hot Moon. And I was also interested in astronomy. My father and I had a telescope in the backyard, and so I would look at the stars and the galaxies from home in the north of England. I did study physics at Oxford, and so I got a degree in physics and a PhD in astrophysics. And so I didn't write a whole lot in my 20s. I was too busy doing the career thing. Lachlan will recognize what I'm talking about here. Too busy with life. I moved to the United States for a job at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center when I was 28. And then in my early 30s, I decided, well, it was really time. If I'm going to do the fiction thing, I need to get back to that now. So that was when I really started writing short fiction again and writing it seriously in an attempt to get it published. And so the astrophysics career and the writing career really have gone along side by side with some, pauses on either side. So I never really went from one to the other, but was always interested in both.
And what is it that you think draws readers to science fiction?
Okay, well, I guess different readers could be drawn by different things. It is a very wide genre. Back in the 40s and 50s, I guess writers were writing about space travel and its consequences and giant robots and computers and stuff like that. And so they were talking about the technologies, where those might be going, trying to extrapolate, and what the societal impacts might be. And I think science fiction has gone on in that kind of way ever since, looking at new developments. Things like cloning and climate change and all of this kind of stuff. I think a lot of science fiction writers are interested in society as well, and they're kind of looking ahead to see what might come as a result of things like cloning. There's also the fun aspect. There's also wondering what other planets are like, what it's like to go to the moon or travel to the farthest reaches of space and time. So there's a lot of flights of fantasy and that kind of thing. What it would be like to travel in time, for example. I've always been interested in time travel stories as well as alternate history. And there's a certain amount of wish fulfillment there. I suppose people want to know what it's like to go to other planets or to go back in time, or any of the other things. As I said, science fiction, I think, is a very broad field, and people can come to it for all kinds of reasons. But some of it, if people are only used to the science fiction that they see in the movie theater, films that they're seeing, they might be surprised at the depth and breadth of science fiction in the written world, because there's a lot of really kind of powerful and thoughtful science fiction writing out there on the bookshelves. And so some of it is actually quite challenging to read. It's not just all ray guns and stuff. So I think all of these, but I think largely science fiction does try and respond to, in some ways, to what's going on in the society when it's written. We're often exploring possibilities for now or the near future through fiction. So I think there are many different reasons, but I think that all of them are valid, and I think all of them actually apply to me. I'm interested in the extrapolation. I'm interested in talking about society, but I'm also interested in the fun stuff.
On that note, who would you sort of cite as your references in writing in science fiction writing?
When I was young, I guess I did read a lot of Golden Age science fiction. So people like Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. I read Ursula Le Guin, Larry Niven. I actually also read C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. I read a fair amount of fantasy at that time as well. The Powell Anderson Guardians of Time, time travel novels and short stories I enjoyed reading as well, because, like I said, I was into time travel. Not just the science fictional stuff, though. I also liked Rosemary Sutcliffe, who was a historical writer. I read a fair amount of historical fiction, so I guess it's easy looking back to see how I got interested in alternate history, which is kind of the convergence of science fiction and history writing. I love the Master and Commander novels by Patrick O'Brian, and Stephen Pressfield has written a lot of really immersive historical fiction. Particularly enjoyed the Afghan campaign, which I've read several times. He wrote a lot of ancient history, historical things. And so I think those are influences as well. More recently, people like Robert J. Sawyer and Stephen Baxter and Harry Turtledove and Joe Walton. I read a fair amount of all of those. And these days, I learn a lot from my peers when I go to writers' workshops, pro-level writers' workshops, where we're all critiquing each other. And so, I mean, we're all publishable writers, but we're writing to try and push the level of the fiction even higher, and hopefully maybe even into awards contention. So if I have influences now, I think it's probably from what I've learned from people who I'm in those kinds of workshops with.
That's a really interesting point, because I think that there's always been a little bit of a tension as to, whether science fiction, and I mean, obviously Ursula K. Le Guin is a great example of somebody who really sort of pushed the boundaries in terms of what can be literary and the kind of critical acclaim that, sort of writers of science fiction who are doing amazing stuff, and yet because of the sort of the genre label, perhaps don't get the same sort of level of literary acclaim. Do you think that is something that's changing?
The literary acclaim thing, I think people are more used to science fiction now. I think it's much more in the zeitgeist in society. Things that were seen as kind of dorky or very off to left field a while ago are now sort of mainstream. A lot of the most popular movies are science fiction based. There's a lot of bleed over, I think, in the straight fiction world, in the straight literary world. I think you find a lot of science fictional ideas. The mainstream seems to be more accepting of time travel stories, as long as there's a lot of character-driven stuff and literary things in there. So I think a lot like things like The Time Traveler's Wife and a couple of novels by I'm going to forget the name of the author, but there's a British author who actually writes a lot of things that are essentially what I would call science fiction, but they're written for a slightly different market, a literary mainstream sort of market. Lucy St. John Mandel, for example, and other people. So I think it is changing in a lot of ways. I think the field has always been literary in some parts of it, and I think Ursula Le Guin is obviously a good example of that. She was writing a lot about societies and what the social systems on different planets, and questions of sexuality, which were very advanced for the time. And it's written in a very It is written in a very literary way. It's written in a very competent way. A lot of science fiction from the early days was written in a very transparent style where you're seeing through to the story. But that means there's not much beauty of language. And Ursula Le Guin had the beauty of language. And a lot of the other, several other earlier writers did have some beauty of language as well. So, but I think that to your main point, I think it is, I think things have changed over the last decades, and seeing science fiction ideas in a very well-written formats, and a lot of science fiction writers do write in a very well-written sort of way as well these days. So I think we are seeing a convergence now of what would used to be seen as fantastic literature and realistic literature in what's being published these days.
Well, I personally found, you know, you were a beautiful prose stylist in
Oh,
Radiant Sky, and in fact,
thank you.
that's one of the questions that I do want to ask you. But also, I think the other aspect of it is, you know, sort of just the complexity of the characters and the kind of the thematic exploration that was, you know, sort of throughout sort of Radiant Sky, as opposed to that sort of really sort of transparent sort of, which has its purpose, you know, genre writing. So yeah, totally. But you know, for science fiction aficionados, there are many genres and subgenres with their own specific features to choose from. What kind of science fiction writer are you? And what are some of the tropes and features of science fiction that you enjoy and help you with the writing process?
Yes, I'm now pretty much exclusively a historical and alternate history writer, mainly alternate history. And this has happened over the years. I have actually had short stories published that are horror, that are fantasy, that are hard science fiction, as Radiant Sky is. But nowadays, and for the last 15 years, I think all of my short fiction and long fiction has been alternate history. And this is work set in alternate timelines where there's been a divergence from our history into a different timeline, into a different type of history. And also, I think people are much more familiar with that kind of genre these days due to things that they've seen in the movies or to books they've read. So yes, my output is mostly alternate history these days. I have the Clash of Eagles series, which was published by Random House Del Rey in 2015 through 2017. And in these books, the Roman Empire has survived until the 13th century in its classical form and is now moving into North America at the time when the Mississippian culture is at its height. And the books we're talking about today, which are Hot Moon and Radiant Sky, those are much more contemporary, set in 1979 and the early 1980s. And these are in a world where the space race continued and where the Americans and the Soviets have bases on the moon, like kind of clunky bases because the technology is true to the times. So we have Apollo spacecraft and Soyuz spacecraft, and so I get to have the first battle in space, which is a very slow motion battle as it happens because of the limitations of the technologies. And so, yes, so the alternate history genre, I think, is the one where I'm most at home now. And the reason is there's a strong what if part of this, right? And that what if is something that we all tend to do all the time anyway. Thinking about our own lives, we do tend to think, how could things have been different in our lives? What would have happened if I had made a different decision here or there? How would things be different now? And a lot of us think of that in the world of politics. How would things have changed now if certain things hadn't happened a few years ago? So I think a lot of history is contingent, and I like exploring that kind of thing. I think due to the actions, I don't think history is a monolith. I think that things could have gone a very different way due to the actions of one important person or the outcome of a battle. And it is kind of fascinating to think how things would have been different radiating out from that. And I think one of the things about writing alternate history is you get the resonances. You know what happened in the real history. And so that kind of informs how you're looking at the alternate history. You mentioned the Sidewise Award, and the second Sidewise Award I got was for a story called Gunpowder Treason. And in Gunpowder Treason, the point of divergence, the thing that is different, is that the gunpowder plot in 1605 succeeds. There is this huge gunpowder explosion in London and the ramifications of that spreading outwards. And I think it's for sure that England would never have been the same again. They would have had a highly different history in the 17th century, and that would have affected neighboring countries and other things. And so I'm exploring a few of those ramifications in that short story. But the reader knows what happened in the real gunpowder plot, that it didn't happen and that Guy Fawkes was executed and so forth. But they see the effects of that. And so I think that's an interesting thing about alternate history, both to explore the new history and to think about how history itself works, how all of that, how history is put together, and tell an entertaining story at in the same time, hopefully.
That's fascinating because, you know, sort of one of the things that I always think distinguishes, you know, a great writer from an ordinary writer is the richness of the stories that they're telling. You know, it feels very much that, you know, your ability to sort of think about what readers can also bring to the story that you then sort of are able to build off creates this, you know, sort of quite sort of startling effect on the page. And also I think it's the verisimilitude, you know, that richness of detail and the immersion qualities. So could you talk a little bit about, you know, just how you bring, you know, sort of that immersive quality to your prose?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that really is in the level of detail and getting the level of detail right. And writers are often told to be more specific about things. If you're talking about a general comment, maybe replace that with something that is specific. When you're describing somewhere, go with very concrete features. Go with what the character is seeing or smelling, or some little details of what's around them that kind of really brings it to life and makes it immersive. In the North American stories, the stories set in a lot of the Clash of Eagles stories are actually set in the North American city of Cahokia, which is a mound building city in the 13th century, built by Native Americans. It had a population of about 20,000, and I really wanted to try and get the details of what it would be like to be there correct. I wanted to get all of the details of what the of the flowers, what people were eating, what their diet consisted of, what they looked like, how the whole place might feel to be there. I really wanted to get that immersive quality. And of course, you can go too far. You can bury the reader in detail, and that's also something that you don't want to do. You want to get the specific details that are right to help the reader believe that they're there. And it is that immersive quality that I like reading in the fiction. I talked about Stephen Pressfield. He's a good case study for how to get the right amount of detail, how to really make you feel that you're marching with Alexander across an Asia that is not really well understood. He does a great job of that. I think a lot of science fiction writers do a really good job of making you feel you're on another planet. But I think you really need to know what the planet is like. If you're doing that, you need to really know what it's like to be there yourself so that you can write it. And with Radiant Sky and Hot Moon, I spent a lot of time researching. I'd always been interested, but I always spent a lot of time researching like how the spacesuits are put together and how what it felt like inside the Apollo command module and lunar module, and how far things were away, you know, where the instruments were and everything, and tried to make it so that those details were accurate and that they felt accurate. And so the reader would really kind of believe that they're in the command module or in the lunar module through the experiences of the characters, of my main characters who were there. And so I do spend as much time thinking about the setting as I do about the characters and the action, and trying to bring them all in so that the pacing is right, but they're at a good level, and that readers can really get that sense of being there.
Look, as somebody who's professed to not being a reader of science fiction, I was a little perturbed by the hard science fiction and worried that it wouldn't be something that would engage me. But I have to say, from that very opening chapter, I was gripped. And part of that was certainly the experience of, sort of Vivian Carter in a suit with no oxygen and no, sort of shutting down. And the
Yes.
corporality of that experience was, I mean, it was a visceral reading experience. And, I think that in terms of sort of hooking a reader, and also, sort of actually, because often you can have a fantastic opening scene, but then it's difficult to maintain that level of, sort of tension, excitement, action, and yet the plotting is just sort of superlative, because it does carry the reader all the way through to the end, and to the point where I will say I will want a third. I will want the third book, because we are, without giving anything away, we have some tenterhooks, right to the very end. But the thing that really strikes me is that there's a large cast of characters. And yes, of course, sort of Vivian Carter, Peter Solander, perhaps the main characters, but all of the characters do, sort of very much come to life. Can you talk a little bit about how you as a writer sort of managed to create a convincing set of characters, but also a set of characters who essentially have, sort of trajectories, and, sort of a dimension to them?
Yes, yeah, we spent quite a bit of time talking about setting, but people do read the books for the characters. Sometimes they read them for the setting. I sometimes read books for the setting, but it really is the characters that draw people in and help the reader kind of identify. And some of that is the relationship between the characters. And what I spent a lot of time doing was trying to get the camaraderie between the astronauts right and the cosmonauts, because we also see things from the cosmonauts' points of view in both books. So I think it is, I do spend a lot of time on that, and I spend a lot of time on dialogue. Like the dialogue back and forth is often what I'll write first in a scene, so that I get the feel of what's happening and who the characters are and how they're interrelating. Yeah, so in the Clash of Eagles books, in fact, the earlier books, in the trilogy, I had over 100 named characters, and I had to have dramatis personae to keep the people straight. There's an appendix in each book. There's not quite as many characters in the Vivian Carter books, but I did have to be careful and to make sure that they were all real people. And I think one of the key things is to make sure that they all have real motivations, and that these can be complicated and perhaps not even internally self-consistent. I mean, Vivian Carter herself, sometimes she's at odds with the Soviets, sometimes, but what she really wants is for everyone to get along in space. And this is obviously kind of a little idealistic. She wants to collaborate with Soviets where she can. She really kind of hates the Cold War in a way. She wants humankind to go together into space and all of that, and wants to collaborate, even while pragmatically she realizes that this is fraught with difficulties, and often she finds herself very much on the sharp end of those difficulties and in conflict situations. And so characters' keep saying motivations can be complicated, but also I think the important thing is to make sure that even the minor characters have personalities of their own. In Hot Moon, for example, Vivian comes aboard a space station with 6 guys on, and they all happen to be guys in this case. There are women in the space program. They're at a lower, they're obviously not 50-50. It's about 15-20% of them are women, which is far better than we did in the actual 1970s, but worse than we would like to see, and not as good as we have now. And I needed to make sure that I differentiated. There's all these guys, right? They all have buzz cuts. They're all astronauts. But I wanted to make sure that they were each distinct characters, and it wasn't just like this mess of 6 guys in a can. And so I made sure that I knew whether they were Army, Navy, or Air Force, where they came from, whether they were bulky or compact, what color their hair was. And that was just the start. I wanted to know where they came from, what their accents were, how they got on with each other, whether they spoke in a very clipped way, like astronauts tend to, or talked more in paragraphs, like I tend to, like I'm doing right now. But that was something, and what their word choices were. At the beginning of Hot Moon, Vivian is in a command module with her 2 crewmen. She's the commander, and she has Dave Horn, who is her command module pilot, and Ellis Meyer, who is the lunar module pilot. And I gave them all distinct ways of talking. So you can actually tell eventually by their word choices who is talking, even though I don't necessarily have character to, spoken tags next to each other. It's obvious who's talking from the way they're talking and how they're talking to each other, how they're talking to Vivian, and all of that kind of thing. And that is something that I also spent a while making sure I got internally self-consistent, that the characters do talk in their own specific ways. And that leads back to their characters. So what they say is important, what they do is important, how they react is important. And so those are many of the things that I took time to make right, and that I hoped would make the characters leap off the page and be believable as real people. And the crew at the beginning of the second book is the same. I spent a while making sure that I knew those characters before I tried to write those characters in the action scenes that begin book two.
You keep track of that, sort of because you have a phenomenal sort of memory, or do you actually have notebooks and, sort of, I guess, an external sort of hard drive sort of thing?
I did start out by doing it kind of organically and just doing it as I went along and remembering as I went along, because I had a lot of scenes where these characters were, so it wasn't too hard to keep it all together in Hot Moon. When I came back to some of the same characters after a pause in Radiant Sky, I did have to go back and reread it and remind myself who was what, who says yes, who says yep, who says yeah, all the minor stuff and the larger stuff, and who has a Texas accent and who doesn't, and all of that stuff. I had to actually go and write down little character sheets, little character paragraphs to make sure that I was writing them consistently in the second book in the same way that I had in the first book. So it's a little bit of both. The memory does hold me so far, but after a while I do have to write stuff down and figure it out and go back and through and edit and make sure that I'm getting things right.
One of the things that I found fascinating were the way that you managed sort of real world political tensions, like the Cold War, Red China, US Soviet tension. And, they're clearly really important to the Apollo Rising, sort of series as a whole. Can you talk a little bit about the role of juggling those sort of real world sort of political tensions in your fiction?
Yeah, yes, I can. Um, Both Hot Moon and Radiant Sky are set entirely on and around the moon. There aren't any scenes set on Earth at all in those two books. So your focus is very much on what's happening off the Earth, what's happening in Earth orbit, what's happening on the lunar surface, what's happening in orbit around the moon and close to the moon. So your focus there is on the astronauts, but obviously everything they're going through is being informed by what's happening on the Earth. In the first book, even though I'm in a different, an alternate past, a lot of things are happening the same way that they did in our time. The Soviet Union is still invading Afghanistan. That invasion goes in a slightly different way. It happens a little earlier, actually, because of very good reasons. I don't necessarily get into a lot of the reasons, but things are happening that are going to be recognizable to people who were around during those times or who have read a lot about those times. And in the second book, that's also true. And in the third book, which I'm writing now, it's also true that we're seeing a lot of things that really did happen in the 1980s, a lot of the scares, a lot of the things that took place with Reagan and everything. And Star Wars features in the books, the Strategic Defense Initiative. That's a strong motivation for some of the quite justifiable Soviet paranoia about what the Americans are doing and what the Americans are doing in space. And so that's a very important backdrop. So we find out about that through direct reporting from people on Earth who are talking to the astronauts, or through news or things. So, various interactions, conversations between the astronauts themselves. And so a lot of the motivation for what's happening in space stems directly from what's happening in the Cold War on Earth and what the tensions and threats are. There's really kind of a proxy war going on in space in the same way that Vietnam was a proxy war on Earth. There are things happening in space where things break out into direct conflict in a way that would happen less on the Earth, just because it's kind of further away and people's attention isn't necessarily there. And so, yeah, the role of real world tensions and politics and prejudices does weigh into the background and the action of the Hot Moon series, the Apollo Rising series, in a big way. And I think that's true in science fiction generally, that what's happening, what happens in the real world does inform what's happening in the politics of the stories. So I think is that what you were getting at? I think that's probably a
Yeah, look,
partial answer.
I found it fascinating because obviously, these are tensions that are present today, and I really admired the way that you allowed your characters to have both, sort of the prejudices, of the time, or, even to the present, where sort of there is sort of real antagonisms that are sort of very much sort of part of our political landscape now.
Yes.
And yet you could also, particularly in the characters like sort of Vivian Carter, where you see her sort of wrestle with her sort of deeper sort of moral compass and her feelings about people. So I'm thinking about I think it's Svetlana, the
Svetlana, yes.
yeah.
Svetlana Belyakova.
Yeah, Velyakova. You can see her sort of wrestling with those, and sort of the sort of the innate mistrust. And in fact, even in the initial sort of encounter with the one sort of the collaboration between the Russians and the Soviet Union and the US in that period, but also because it is one of those things where I think good literature doesn't cave in to sort of real world prejudices, but rather sort of holds them there to be sort of wrestled with and grappled with. And I think that's sort of what I was relieved to see, I think.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to
because at the beginning,
I think this comes back to character, because not everybody is going to behave in the same way. Different people are going to bring their own experiences. Some of the guys, in particular in Hot Moon, had been in Vietnam. They had a very different idea, a very different view of what the Soviets were like. Some people were very hard over on hating anything to do with the Soviets and anything, and always having a natural distrust. And other people are more idealistic. And Vivian Carter, of course, has a little more balanced view. And Nikolai Makarov, who we meet in the first book, a Soviet, he has a much more idealistic view as well, one that is rather kind of laughed at in a way, not laughed at so much, but there's an obvious tension between him and the woman, the cosmonaut you just mentioned, Svetlana Belyakova, who is much more suspicious, much more aggressive in how she perceives American imperialism. She's much more of a card-holding communist than he is. He sees things slightly differently to her. Vivian sees things slightly differently from the people around her, and the people around her are a spectrum, essentially, of various beliefs and various levels of knowledge that they have about both what the Americans are doing and what the Soviets are doing on Earth and in space. And so you can get some interesting tensions in the book between the characters based on that, between what they're likely to believe and want. This leads into their motivations as well, and their fears and everything. So yes, it was a fun way to explore the world of the Cold War through the lenses of the various characters in the Apollo Rising books.
Yeah, well, look, I appreciated that because, sort of at the outset where I wasn't 100% sure of where things were going or what was going to, I had, sort of feared that we were going to have a very sort of stereotypical, sort of journeys through those tensions. But actually what happens is that we end up with a really sort of complex and balanced, sort of, foray, which, is technically a very difficult thing to pull off, I think. So I much appreciated that, and I'm curious to see where this will go in sort of the next level. Lachlan, you had a question for Alan.
So going back to the sort of alternate history discussion, I did notice that the point of divergence for Apollo Rising's alternate history, that is that Soviet cosmonauts land on the moon ahead of the US, and which results in a more prolonged and rapid advancement of space exploration and technology. That is quite similar to one in the TV series For All Mankind. And I was curious if these novels, if there was anything about them that was a response intended as a response to that show, or if it was more of a coincidence, I suppose.
No, it was actually more of a case of parallel development there. I started writing Hot Moon immediately after I finished with the Clash of Eagles series in 2017 or so. It took me a while to write because I was actually writing two different things at the same time. I had two different book series that I was thinking about. One set in the 4th century AD in the Mediterranean on Earth, and the other one set in space. So I was working on these and kind of bouncing backwards and forwards between them. So it took me a while to write the first Hot Moon book. But in fact, what happened was that I found out about the Apple TV series For All Mankind quite late on. And in fact, I'd already delivered the complete manuscript to my agent and to my beta readers by the time the first episode aired. So I knew it was coming. People had said, hey, when the original press release came out about For All Mankind, I was like, oh gosh. I wasn't very happy at that precise moment because I thought I had something fresh and original and exciting and that nobody else was doing. And it turned out that somebody else was doing that. I didn't actually watch the first episode of For All Mankind until after the first book came out. And this was something my agent actually was keen on. She said, don't freak yourself out. It's completely different from what you're doing. Just wait for a while. And so that is in effect what I did. I actually like the series. I particularly like the first 2 seasons where they're looking at they're looking at things in a kind of similar way. So yes, the initial premise is roughly the same, because the guy they called the great engineer, Sergei Korolev, sorry, because he survives his health issues at the beginning of 1967, the Soviet space program is more successful, and they do end up landing on the moon first, and just beating Apollo with the 11 to the punch there. But I think the two things. This is the interesting thing about the point of divergence, because then the two the two things go off in a completely different way. For All Mankind does concentrate largely on what happens on Earth. There are some soap opera elements. There's a large cast of characters. I think it's actually very well done. Particularly the first and second series, like I said, where they're talking about the Apollo program itself, by and large, and the US base on the moon. And so I really enjoyed that, and I thought they did a great job of it. I also think it's actually completely different from what happened in my Hot Moon series, which is set entirely on and around the moon with a much smaller cast of characters and less of the Earth politics. So I think we've got ourselves kind of a neat little subgenre there, alternate Apollo fiction. And there are also now some short stories being published in Analog magazine by Rosemary Claire Smith. One of those short fiction pieces is also set in an alternate Apollo era, and that won the most recent Sidewise Award for alternate history. And so we're all doing these things where we're talking about it. Well, Rosemary and I are talking about it amongst ourselves to make sure we don't accidentally get too close to what the other one is doing for our future tales. And so, but it's really interesting to write, and we're getting really different stories out of what are kind of a very similar sort of starting point.
Yeah, I imagine that moment where you first heard about For All Mankind must have been quite frustrating. But I agree, obviously, you've explored it. The two texts have explored it in quite different directions. It is curious how these things, this kind of thing actually happens fairly often. It's just that I suppose that the seeds for an idea are in the culture, and by some kind of parallel or convergent evolution, they tend to appear at roughly the same time, completely independently, like the light bulb, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think we were coming up to a big anniversary at the time. We were coming up to the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing. And I figured when I was writing this, I was naively hoping things would develop a lot more quickly than they did. So I started writing Hot Moon in the middle of 2017. I had some hopes that maybe it would get published around the time of the 50th anniversary of the Apollo missions, and that would help the sales of the book. To be, pragmatic about it, I was hoping that would work for me in a good way. And it's quite possible that the writers of the Apple TV series were thinking along the same lines. I just came back and looked it up, and the first TV show trailer came out in June 2019. And that was when I breathed a sigh of relief, because it seemed, from the trailer, that it seemed almost entirely set on Earth. And so that was actually a great relief to me. And like I say, by the time it premiered in November 2019, my whole book was finished and in the hands of my agent. And things took longer than we expected. I didn't get the first offer for the Hot Moon publication until February 2021, and then the editing process takes a while. And then COVID happened, and I mean, COVID was happening around about that time, so that was one of the reasons why everything slowed down when I had the book out with various publishers. So it did take a while, and so the book ended up coming out well after the 50th anniversary. But I was very encouraged that the 50th anniversary was actually a big deal in the US and maybe in other places as well. And so I think a lot of people got interested in the Apollo program, reinterested in the Apollo program then. And so maybe that helped the sales of the book as well. So I think it's all worked out pretty well, actually. I'm kind of pleased in the final event. I did have this gulp moment where my editor was writing to me and saying, "Do you know about this thing that I'm hearing news about, the Apple TV series? Is anything likely to happen with that?" And I'm like, I have no idea, because at the time, again, not to belabor the point, but the Apple TV series, we weren't sure what the quality was going to be or anything. It might have sunk without trace. Unfortunately, it didn't, I think. I think it is a very good series, and there are a lot of really good Apple TV dramas out there these days coming out on that network. So, but I think everything has actually worked pretty well together in a very kind of synergistic way, and so I'm happy the way things have turned out, actually.
But also just an observation, because when I was thinking about how you first began writing, even as a child, where it was so clearly based on the things that you'd read and loved and watched, sometimes I think that there's a false cult around originality and what actually makes something original, because so often it's actually the sort of the richness of the reimagination or the reimagining of stories, as opposed to sort of feeling as though you're reinventing the wheel every single time you tell a story. And, I imagine that there is a certain, sort of solidity to sort of writing stories in shapes and forms and sort of with features that are familiar, recognizable and necessary to the story, because it really, sort of formulates part of, I guess, a really sort of powerful genealogy of stories. And, that connection of sort of humans to sort of history, stories, and the events that have, sort of mattered and changed. So, I mean, and one of my observations is that especially people who are starting out in writing, the desire to do something that's never been done before, in any way, shape, or form is often a sort of a fool's journey in many respects.
Yeah, and I think that's right. As long as you don't fall back on cliches, there are lots of genres that have been done to death, like vampires or dragons or whatever. But when I say done to death, I just mean there's a lot of it around. And if you can think of an original way of looking at that, then people are going to see the familiar. Maybe they like dragon stories, and the unfamiliar, in that you're putting a whole new twist on it, whatever your own personal twist is as a writer. Your dragon isn't going to be the same as everybody else's dragon. Your vampire might hopefully be different from everybody else's vampire. My Apollo program is different from other people's Apollo programs, and I have other things coming into it than happen in other books. So I think you're right. I think it's a question of putting your own stamp on something, and when you're a journeyman writer, not being freaked out by the fact that maybe what you're doing is in the same kind of ballpark as somebody else's. The idea is to avoid doing what everybody has seen 100 times before and do it in a way that is uniquely yours.
So obviously, with your career in astrophysics, you have a tremendous wealth of research and knowledge and expertise to draw upon when you write your science fiction. Yet, in your alternate histories, I imagine that there's a sort of an equal demand to gain knowledge and expertise in those areas as well, which aren't in your, sort of central sort of ballpark. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you do in creating these alternate worlds?
Yes, sure. So when I realized that the Clash of Eagles series, I'll start there. The Clash of Eagles series, like I said, involves the Romans invading North America in the 13th century. And I grew up in England. There's a lot of Roman remains there. I used to spend family vacations on Hadrian's Wall, and I went to Roman Bath and all of that. I was always interested in Romans. So I thought, okay, I know a lot about Romans. Where I obviously need to put my focus is in Native Americans, because I did not grow up in the United States. I don't have that background of knowledge that some people do. A lot of people don't, but some people do in North America. So I knew I was going to have to really work hard at that side of things, and I did. I did a lot of reading. I read all I could get my hands on about Cahokia, about the cultures that were in the area at the time, about other Native American tribes and nations, because obviously all of these communities and tribes and nations have differences about in what they wear and what they eat and how much we know about them in some cases. So I knew I was going to have to do a heck of a lot of research there, and so I read about 150 books about the Native American cultures and about ancient North America. What I didn't realize is that I was also going to have to know a heck of a lot more about the Romans than I did as well, because of course I knew the basics, but I needed if I'm going to go with the Roman legion across, like if I'm going to land a Roman legion on the Chesapeake Bay and then march them westwards, I'm going to need to know far more about what the legions, the internal structure of the legions, how all of the footwear worked, like the sandals and the boots and all of that, and how camp was set at night, and all of these details that I would need to have them in North America. And I was also going to have to extrapolate a little, because obviously things haven't changed, haven't remained unchanged in 1,000 years. The legions themselves are a little different. How things are put together are a little different. In my case, the auxiliaries are more combined with the regular legions, with the regular legionaries, and they have steel now, which is a big difference. So a number of things are different, a number of the things are the same. So I had to do quite a lot of research into the Romans as well. So I had to do a wealth of research for both of them. For the Apollo Rising books, it's actually easier in some ways, both because I lived through that period and because of the vast amount of documentation that NASA has online. My research is in astrophysics. I do not have a human spaceflight background, but I do know something about that world through having had the NASA career. And NASA has a lot of documentation online at its history.gov site and in various other places. That's not the correct website name, by the way, but you can Google it. They have a fair amount of stuff that is available. So when I wanted to know more about the Apollo command modules or the spacesuits, to give two examples that I mentioned before, there's a manual on each. There's like a 120-page manual on how the spacesuits worked. And so I could figure out what I was going to keep the same and what I was going to change about those suits and about everything else. And so I could quite easily go down a research rabbit hole for quite a long period of time. And one of the tricks about research is knowing when to stop and when you know enough, and when it's time to write. And in fact, in my case, the research keeps going through the writing, but I am at all times trying to make sure that I'm writing accurately, but in an interesting way. And we covered this earlier, not deluging the reader with too much detail, but making sure that the details I include are the right details. And I'm doing due respect to the Native Americans or the astronauts or the technical systems or whatever it may be.
Lachlan, I think you had another question for Alan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I did do a quick search of the ADS abstract system for your publications,
Mm-hmm.
and I noted that you're sort of interested in time domain astronomy, especially in sort of the high energy regime. And I was curious, this isn't strictly related to that, but I'm curious if there's ever a temptation to include characters or more exposition that have a similar sort of research interest as you. Were you tempted to show X-ray astronomy at work on the moon or that sort of thing when you were writing Apollo Rising?
It wasn't particularly relevant to the first two books. In the third book, we're in a scientific situation where actually it does become relevant to look at various celestial bodies like the sun and other celestial bodies across the range of the electromagnetic spectrum from your end, if you like, which is the radio end, to my end. I did most of my research, as you said, in X-ray and gamma ray astronomy, which is the high energy astrophysics side of things. And the high energy astrophysics, essentially, what the point of that is you're looking at photons that come from very extreme physics, whether it's black holes or neutron stars, or it's very high temperatures. So it's either high gravitational fields or high temperatures. So you're looking at a lot of extreme physics when you're looking in the X-ray waveband. And so the sun, for example, looks very different in X-rays than it does in radio or ultraviolet or the infrared. And so that was what I did spent my professional life doing. So I did enjoy putting in the third book a few kind of Easter eggs, if you like, about the X-ray astronomy side. So it doesn't feature strongly. I do refer, I think, to some higher energy experiments in the second book, just in passing, and various things that are done on the lunar surface. So some of my professional expertise did come in there. But largely, I didn't do a lot of planetary physics. I didn't do a lot of lunar physics, except towards the end. Interestingly, right at the end of my career, before I retired from NASA at the end of August 2023, I was, in fact, the deputy project scientist for a payload where we actually wanted to put an instrument on the lunar surface looking back towards the Earth. And so for that, I did actually have to learn from my professional life some things about the lunar environment, which did help when I was writing Hot Moon and the sequel. So there was this strange convergence there between my professional and literary life, but those things don't actually happen very often. By and large, I keep these things separate, and often by design. One of the reasons I got into, or one of the reasons why I enjoyed writing historical fantasy and alternate history, was that it was completely different from the day job. It was kind of a relief from the day job. I wasn't doing the same thing in both of my areas. I was doing something completely different in my evenings and weekends. But now the convergences are happening more and more.
It was the most real that the moon had ever felt to me, and I think the craters and sort of the descriptions and the proportions of that you really captured did actually change the way that I thought about sort of space, the moon. So I actually deeply appreciated that. Even the sense of the I know that they're not seas, but that they'd been named the Mare, all of the craters, but I think particularly the three different types of craters and the one with a really sheer wall. And I mean, the fact that I can still talk about these things, I've now got those images in my mind, which I think I will probably always carry with me now. So I'm really grateful to you for that. But
that's great.
What advice do you have for writers starting out in science fiction, and for those science fiction writers who actually might have a sort of a manuscript that they're sitting on, hoping to do something with?
I think one of the greatest things you have to do is persevere. I've been in writers' workshops when I was younger. I was in writers' workshops with people who hadn't been published, and a lot of those people were never published because they didn't persevere, and not because they weren't really good enough. And that's fine. You can get interested in other things, and you can go on, and you don't have to be a writer just because for a while you thought you wanted to be one. But if you really want to be a writer, then perseverance is key. We touched on some of the other things earlier on, to be original, to be as original as possible within a field that's obviously been mined extensively in many areas. I think it's important to get the sense of wonder into your writing and to write something that you are really interested in yourself and really find is fascinating. I've always found the Apollo missions fascinating, and I think hopefully, or probably, possibly, some of that fascination comes across in the fiction itself and helps to excite the reader. And so I think you need to write about something you're really interested in, and you're probably going to be rereading your own manuscript a number of times. So it helps to be really interested in what you're writing about, because you're going to be rereading it a lot. Complications and gritty backgrounds and making sure you understand the background and the setting, and all of those things are important, and we've touched on some of that before. I guess the way I think of this, of types of stories in my mind, is know what type of story you're writing. There are two really well-known US magazines, and they've been around for some period of time. And there's the story that I think of as the analog science fiction story after the magazine. And those are often problem-solving stories. Those are the stories where characters get into a fix and have to figure a way out of it. Problem-solving stories are really interesting. I tend to write the other sort, though, which are more published in Asimov Science Fiction magazine, which I've been published in myself a few times. And those tend to be more about choices and consequences. They're all about science fiction or fantasy. They're all mainly science fiction in both of those cases. They're all science fictional stories, but they're exploring them in different ways. And so you can take a situation, a setting, and work through the consequences of a character's action. And I think the analog stories tend to be more about the science, and the Asimov stories tend to be more about the character, and about the characters. And I think it does help to keep straight in your story, in your mind, what type of story you're writing. There's no right answer, but it does help you, particularly with knowing where to send the manuscripts to get published. And that's, I think, the second part of your question, which is advice to scientists who are trying to get published. I guess it's probably different. I don't know whether you were talking specifically about short fiction or about long fiction. There's a lot of short fiction markets that writers can work their way through, sending manuscripts out and getting inevitably rejected and then having to send out to other markets. And I and every other writer I know have been rejected multiple times, often for stories that got published and got maybe some acclaim after that for the quality of the storytelling and so on. So that's where the perseverance comes in. I think you really have to stick to it and not get discouraged if your manuscript is rejected 20 times, because there probably is still a market. There is still an editor out there who might like it. And the same is true for longer fiction. I think there are some stories that everybody hears about like the first Harry Potter novel being rejected 20 times before it was accepted. Longer fiction, the road that I went was to get an agent first. I went with the Clash of Eagles books. I wrote a novella called A Clash of Eagles, which was published in an anthology of original novellas, and it was that won my first Sidewise award. But at the time, I knew that I was interested enough in this world to write a novel based in that world. And so I was looking for an agent around about the same time, and having the Sidewise award didn't hurt, obviously. And so I wanted to get an agent because I wanted to pitch to the major publishers, and you can't do that unless you have an agent. So that was my route, and it worked out pretty well for me. But there are also a lot of independent publishers who you don't need an agent to submit to. And so that is another route that people can go when they're trying to get published, is to send directly to the smaller independent publishers. And they are smaller, but they are well respected. There's a number of those publishers that I think are worth publishing with. And in fact, Kasich Science Fiction and Fantasy, who publish Hot Moon and Radiant Sky, I would say they're well up in the independents, but they are still an independent. They're still run with a fairly small number of people. There is one publisher, and they have a number of editors who work with them, but there's one main associate editor. Her name is Leslie Robin, and the publisher's name is Shahid Mahmood. And they do a great job with what they do. And I think that they're an extremely well-respected independent publisher. So that is another route that people can go if they have a manuscript. Did I answer the question there, or are there other parts of that you want me to dig more deeply into?
I think Lachlan had a little addendum as well.
Oh yes, I would just,
okay,
out of curiosity, as an astrophysicist myself, if and I suppose it's not really a different answer than the answer you already gave, but if there was anything special that science academics could do when trying to make their own entry into the science fiction market.
I don't think so. I don't think it hurts to mention your professional credentials, and I used to do that as well when I was submitting science fiction pieces. I think it helps the editor to know it doesn't necessarily have to do with the content of the story, but it helps them to know that you are a scientific person who can analyze things in a certain way. And I think the academic background does help in some ways if you have one. Like, for example, I read some when I was researching Native Americans and when I was researching like the history and the archaeology and the anthropology of people who are now studying Cahokia and other ancient cultures, it helped that I wasn't, because I was an academic, it meant that I wasn't really afraid of the jargon. I would start reading an archaeological paper and know that I didn't have the jargon, but hope that it would make sense when I drilled down far enough, and that I kind of recognized the style in which these things were written. So I think that helps. I think that side of it helped me, and I don't think it hurts to just mention in passing in your cover letter or whatever in conversation that you do have that kind of science background. Um, I think the NASA background did help me when I was publishing a book that has a lot of NASA characters, because I tend to know how those people talk and how they think, because I have met a number of astronauts along the way, and astronauts have changed with the years. And so they're not quite the same as the Apollo astronauts, you know, the hardened military types of days of yore. But it does help to know the jargon a little bit, and I think that also helped. So yeah, I think it does help in a way. It doesn't necessarily help with specific publishers. I don't think. I'm not aware of a connection there, but it does support your case, I think.
Just as a final question, you've been so generous with your time. What's next? And are you currently working on any new projects that you'd like to share with us?
At the moment, I'm working really hard on the third book in the Hot Moon in the Apollo Rising series. I am contracted to write that book. That will probably be the last full-length book in the Vivian Carter universe, if you like. So that should be coming out towards the end of next year. I'm still busily writing it. I have a good first draft of it. I'm going through and doing a lot of editing now, because I tend to write really loose first drafts and then fill things out in the edit. That's not the way everybody does it, but I like to get a good idea of the story before I work my way into some of the details of what's happening in the story, and it saves me from having to rework things too much later on. I might write some short fiction in the same universes and try to sell those to Asimov's or other places, Analog. I still do have some other projects in the works. I briefly mentioned the series. I have another alternate history novel that hasn't been published yet, and that's set in the Mediterranean of the 4th century AD and stars Hypatia of Alexandria at the Library of Alexandria. And so I really enjoy that world. I really enjoy writing in it. So far they've thought it, the editors in the mainstream publications have thought this a little bit too obscure, perhaps, for their readers. And so I'm still interested in writing that. It'll probably come out from an independent or a small press. So, but what I think I'd like to do with that is like finish the whole thing and then try and sell it as a whole thing, so that the books come out really close together. And I've noticed that's something that the independents are doing. They're having books in a series that come out a couple of months apart rather than a year or two apart. So I want to work on that. I do have a short fiction novel coming out, completely different genre, at the beginning of January 2026. And this is cryptid fiction, in fact. This is about cryptids are animals that some people think exist, but their existence isn't proved. So Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, they would be cryptids. There is this line called Systema Paradoxa from eSpec Publishing, where they publish cryptid fiction. And so, because I fancied trying something completely different, I will have something coming out from them in January of 2026, like I said. So that's got a way out, but a way out in the future. But that's something I'm kind of interested in. And I would like to get back to doing more short fiction as well. I've been doing a lot of books recently, and I would like to get more works out back in the places where I used to publish, and maybe some new venues. So I think that will be something as a break from the longer books. I think I'm going to get back into short fiction sometime next year when I have time.
My goodness, such a prolific work ethic, I think so. Look, thank you so much for joining us, Alan. It's been an absolute delight and pleasure. Lachlan, thank you so much for accompanying me on our sci-fi moon adventure. And mostly, Alan, thank you so much for writing Hot Moon and the Apollo Rising series, because it is a total gift. And I'm very much hoping that it's not too long to wait before the third in the Apollo Rising series. Thank you, Alan.
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me on. It's been great fun for talking to you, and thanks for those questions. And yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Best of luck. Bye.
Thank you.